And United Nations Secretary-General António Guterres joins us now. Mr. Secretary-General, you are preparing a major address on climate change. It is called The State of the Planet. So let's begin there. What is the state of the planet?
Well, we are at war with nature, and this creates the serious risk to have a broken planet as we move on towards the end of the century. We are still in line with an increase of temperature of 3 to 5 degrees in the end of the century. That would be absolutely devastating for the world economy and for human life. We have destroyed 1 million species, biodiversity seriously into question. We see the risk of the plastic weight in the oceans to become higher than the weight of fish in the middle of the century, not to mention many other aspects.
Yes.
Forests that are disappearing, glaciers that are melting, coral reefs that are bleaching and being destroyed. So it's time for the war between humankind and nature to end. It's time to reconcile humankind with nature. It's time to make peace with nature and to do everything possible for our planet in the end of the century to be something we can be proud of and where our children and grandchildren can live a normal life.
I know you've said that you have made climate change a focus in part because of your own grandchildren, but I want to pick up on the history before we start talking about solutions. Why is humankind at war with nature?
Well, because the logic of the economic development for a long time was a logic of exploitation of everything, of every resource available, without looking into the future, without looking into the limits. There was this idea that we could do everything we wanted, and everything was allowed. And there was no way to price the costs that were invisible, the air that was polluted, the water that was becoming unsafe to drink, the forests that were disappearing, the climate that was being put into question. Now there is a conscience that we are at the limit. This is the moment to change course, and we are still on time to change course.
Mr. Secretary-General, how close are we to a breaking point?
I think we are very close to the breaking point. If you look at temperature, we are now with an increase of temperature, an average increase of temperature of about 1.2 degrees. We want to have 1.5 as the limit. So we are very close to the breaking point. And if we do not act immediately, things will be irreversible. And when things are irreversible, then it means that the future of our children and grandchildren will be dramatically impacted. So this is the moment to change course. And that is why, for the UN, in 2021, we have a very clear objective. And our objective is to build a global coalition for net zero emissions in 2050, for carbon neutrality in 2050. Europe has already committed to do so. Now we had Japan and Korea that have done so 2 weeks ago. China, in the General Assembly, has committed to achieve carbon neutrality before 2060. The incoming American administration has said that they would also abide by the objective of carbon neutrality in 2050. And the international community of scientists tells us this is the condition that is needed to keep the temperature below 1.5 degrees growth at the end of the century. So we can now build this coalition. The conditions are met to build this coalition. Our objective is to have India on board, to have Indonesia on board, to have Brazil on board, to have all countries in the world on board of this movement that already mobilizes 110 countries in the world. And at the same time, to ask all companies, all banks, all cities to also present their own transition plans to net zero, and at the same time to ask countries that will, in 2021, in the run-up to COP26 in Glasgow, all countries in what is technically called the national determined contributions, to assume commitments to drastically reduce emissions in the decade until 2030. I believe this is possible. I believe momentum is growing for that, and this is something that needs to be done, and I hope it will be done.
But, sir, why do you think it's possible now when the United Nations has been talking about this for 30 years, and in that time, the problem has only gotten worse?
But now we are not alone. We see the youth mobilizing in fantastic ways all over the world. We see entrepreneurs gaining conscience. We see asset owners and telling that they need to decarbonize their portfolios, because if not, they will lose money in the future. We see more and more companies saying that they need to align themselves with net zero emissions. We see pressure coming from the civil society. So governments that until now, to a certain extent, thought that they could do whatever they wanted, are now under enormous pressure by public opinions, by the youth, by the private sector to change course. This is a momentum that is gaining ground, and I'm absolutely sure that we'll see in 2021 a very important movement to change course, and we'll do everything possible to push for it.
Let us talk about one of those governments, the government of the United States. As we speak here today, the United States is the only country to leave the Paris Agreement. We are not in it. At the same time, we are the biggest contributor to the problem of climate change. With those two facts in mind, how important was it for Joe Biden to have won the election in 2020?
I think that the fact that the incoming administration has announced that they will again join the Paris Agreement and they will commit to net zero emissions in 2050 is absolutely crucial to rescue the planet. And I believe this is a fundamental contribution. There is no way we can solve the problems of the relationship between humankind, nature, between us and the planet without a strong American leadership.
So I know companies have made commitments and some cities have made commitments, but the fact is that we are not even on pace to reach our current target, and our current target itself is not ambitious enough. So the problem is not solved here. I want to pick up on the prior administration because more than 70 million Americans voted for Donald Trump, a candidate who has no climate change agenda at all, calls it a hoax and a job killer. Are you concerned that we could flip back to the current state of affairs?
I think that the movement for climate action will be irreversible, and more people will see how important this is. So I'm quite optimistic about the future. And I believe that in the United States there will be more and more a bipartisan commitment to climate action in the future. I am totally convinced of that.
What about those 70 million voters who picked the candidate who had no policy at all and pulled out of the agreement?
This was not an election on climate. This was an election on the leadership of the country. What I see, what I believe is that there will be more and more, and when one looks at public opinion surveys, we see it, there are more and more American citizens convinced that the battle for a safe planet, the battle for climate action, is a vital battle for themselves. And I see it translated in the behavior of the American society. What is interesting is that the emissions in the US have decreased during these 4 years. And the emissions in the US have decreased during these 4 years, independently of the government, because the American society was acting in that direction. That is the reason why I'm so optimistic about the future.
We must have different numbers, because I thought emissions in America rose the first 2 years of the Trump presidency, and that global emissions, of which we're the #2 contributor, are continuing to go up.
The global emissions are continuing to go up, but with the measures that are now being announced, they will reverse the trend. And in relation to the US, there was a clear deceleration at least. But my idea is that there was really a reduction, at least in a number of areas.
I'm curious, tactically, you've been a prime minister, you've been a diplomat, you're a trained physicist. Why have you not, in the past 4 years, elected to directly criticize the Trump administration and the United States for its failure to launch an ambitious climate change agenda? Why stay so silent?
No, we have been very clear in relation to our positions in relation to climate, very clear about what needed to be done, very clear saying that not doing it would undermine the future of humankind. So from that point of view, I think the clarity of our positions has been unquestioned.
But Mr. Secretary-General, the United States pulled out of the agreement, did not give you the updates that were required in a timely fashion about where their emissions were, the state of the problem. Nothing happened, no repercussions. What message does that send to the rest of the world?
Well, First of all, that did not happen only with the United States. The system that we have, which is not a system led by the Secretary-General of the United Nations, is an intergovernmental system with the Conference of States Parties. It's the Conference of States Party that is responsible to see how things are in this regard. But obviously, many countries have not been, I would say the majority of the countries have not been able to fulfill their commitments made in Paris. And this is happening a little bit everywhere. And this is what needs to change course. And this is what I believe will change course, because there is a growing conscience that the way we are moving is a suicide in relation to the future and to our future generations.
Suicide is a strong word to use.
It is. It is clear for me that if we would leave temperatures at 0.5 degrees increase at the end of the century, the conditions of living in our planet would be severely undermined.
So to take your metaphor, the world is on the ledge, and your job is to convince the world to step off of it rather than jump.
It is true.
How are you going to do that?
Well, doing our best to mobilize all those that have the same belief in order for them to have a strong influence in world affairs, in governments, in international organizations, in the business community, to make sure that people gain a conscience that this is the moment of truth. And 2021 is the moment of truth, the moment where either we change course or we will irreversibly move into an area where the conditions of life in our planet will be severely undermined. And I believe that the conditions are there, and one of the things related to that is, of course, the announcements made by the incoming administration in the United States. The conditions are there to build the grand coalition that is needed to make again the planet on track.
The incoming Biden administration has pledged to be carbon neutral. Carbon neutral. That's also what the EU is saying. That's what Japan is saying. China is saying carbon neutral by 2060. But carbon neutral means they're still burning fossil fuels. They're just offsetting it with other methods. Do we need to do more than just offset? Don't we need to stop?
What the scientific community has told us is that, first, we need to keep the temperature growth to 1.5 degrees at the end of the century. And to reach this objective, we need to be carbon neutral in 2050. Obviously, after 2050, we'll need to be even more ambitious. But at the present moment, our objective is to reach carbon neutrality for 2050 as a basic condition to get the limit of temperature where it is necessary to avoid catastrophic consequences for our planet. This is the moment to mobilize all countries for a global coalition on carbon neutrality or net zero emissions in 2050.
In your vision, will there be an oil industry and a gas industry at the end of this century?
Well, if there will be oil and gas, probably not as energy sources, but as raw materials for different products that might still be necessary, that might still make sense. It is for me obvious that at the end of the century, the role of fossil fuels as such would be minimal. And I think that we need to start now. And one of the things we have been very strongly advocating is to make sure that there is no more subsidies to fossil fuels, because they are given with taxpayers' money. It doesn't make any sense that taxpayers' money is spent destroying the planet. And at the same time, that no more coal power plants should be built anywhere in the world. And at the same time, that we would shift taxation from income to carbon, from taxpayers to polluters. I understand how difficult it is for a government to increase taxes. So I'm not asking governments to increase taxes. I'm asking governments to reduce the taxes on payroll or on corporations that commit themselves to invest in green energy, for instance, and to put that level of taxation on carbon and on pollution.
Mr. Secretary-General, here's the problem, and I hope you will help me understand. The world's oil and gas companies have trillions of dollars of oil and gas that they know about, that they're waiting to dig up and to sell. Who is going to pay those companies to not dig it up and burn it?
The value of companies in history changes with the changing conditions of the global economy. Some companies had an enormous value, for instance, in railway systems in the past. And today, railways have many difficulties in many countries and need to be subsidized by states. Many fortunes were made with railway business. So, I mean, companies go up and down according to the conditions of life. There was a cycle of oil as the key engine of the world economy. That cycle is finished. So the value of oil and gas companies will diminish as the value of coal companies is already diminishing. And the values of the digital companies is increasing because the digital economy is now in the center, as the oil economy was in the center a few decades ago. This is the normal evolution of humankind. And what makes sense is that those that are asset managers, that have portfolios in the areas related to fossil fuels, the sooner that they move from these portfolios to portfolios linked to the new green and digital economy, the best will be for their own assets and for their own clients. I'm totally convinced that inevitably the history of humankind will be an history such that a lot of the oil and gas that is today in the soil will remain in the soil.
What is your message then to the tens of thousands of workers, particularly here in the U.S.?
The same message for all workers of all sectors that are in transition. That governments have the responsibility to adopt social measures to allow these people not to be left behind. Measures in relation to training, measures in relation to special forms of social protection where the present ones do not work, measures in relation to the recycling of the regions, investments in those regions in other activities, allowing these people to find other and better jobs, doing it in a phased way. I'm not asking for things to stop tomorrow. I'm asking for a transition to be established, and this must be a just transition. I mean, I had in my country, when I was in government, we had to call all coal mines. And we did everything we could to make sure that those that were working in those mines would have their future guaranteed. I mean, the same is happening with many sectors all over the world of many kinds. Things are changing. Many jobs will be lost in many sectors. Many jobs will be created in many others. What we need to do is to invest in people, for people to be able to take profit of these changes, to improve their living conditions. And this is what any government is supposed to do in relation to the oil and gas industry or any other industry that inevitably will be decreasing as others will be growing as the economies are changing.
Have you made contact with President-elect Joe Biden or John Kerry, who will be leading the climate effort for the government?
Of course, the contacts are taking place, and of course, we are entirely at the disposal of any incoming administration in order to make sure to fully support objectives that were announced that are related to the objectives that we are assuming as the international community. Net zero in emissions in 2050, no more than 1.5 degrees at the end of the century. Let's rescue our planet.
We're already at 1.2, so 1.5 may be a little bit ambitious.
It is not. It shows how much we need to change course.
You said earlier that you cannot achieve your goals without the world community, the global community cannot achieve its goals regarding climate without the U.S. helping. How do you hope that the United States will help you achieve your goals?
I do believe that the U.S. leadership is still essential in all key aspects of world affairs today. The U.S. is the biggest military power, is the biggest economy in the world, is the most influential country worldwide. Without American leadership, there is no way the world can move in the right direction.
Any parting remarks to outgoing President Donald Trump, who did all he could to undermine your mission?
I understand that in some people in the United States there is this idea that what makes sense is to have a policy more inward-looking. It is my true belief that we all need to be cosmopolitan, and it is together that we can rescue our planet and improve the living conditions of everybody everywhere.
Mr. Secretary-General, I've enjoyed talking to you. Do you think our grandchildren are going to appreciate this conversation?
I believe so.
All right. Thank you very much. On behalf of Covering Climate Now, Mr. Secretary-General António Guterres, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a great pleasure to be with you today.